As of October 1, 2025, Colombia remains ensnared in a web of profound contradictions. A land of breathtaking beauty and resilient people, its promise of enduring peace is perpetually shadowed by the specter of conflict. A nation of immense natural wealth, it is crippled by deep-rooted inequality that fractures society. This is a country at a crossroads, caught between a future it desires and a past it cannot escape. The aspirational framework of the 1991 Constitution, celebrated for its progressive vision of a pluralistic, rights-based society, now collides violently with a harsh reality: resurgent violence, staggering disparity, and an institutional paralysis that threatens the very foundations of the state. Navigating this turbulent landscape is President Gustavo Petro. His progressive administration, the first of its kind, has championed a bold agenda of total peace and transformative reforms in health, labor, and pensions. However, these ambitions face a wall of fierce resistance. A conservative majority Congress, powerful economic elites, and a skeptical judiciary form a formidable opposition. Key legislation is systematically stalled, and judicial rulings frequently challenge the executive's authority, fueling a political deadlock that has left the country in a state of suspended animation. This paralysis prevents meaningful progress, breeding widespread public frustration and deepening the uncertainty about the country's future. The political stalemate is compounded by a deepening economic crisis. This year, the flexible credit line with the IMF was canceled, a significant blow to market confidence amid widening fiscal deficits and rising debt. The administration's push to transition from fossil fuels has seen crucial oil revenues drop by 34%. The resulting projected 6.7% GDP deficit isn't just a statistic. It signals profound vulnerabilities, translating into rising inflation that harms ordinary citizens and stokes social unrest. This volatile mix erupted into tragedy in August, with the assassination of presidential candidate Miguel Uribe Turbay, a prominent opposition voice. His murder was a chilling echo of Colombia's darkest history of political violence, a direct assault on the democratic process. The assassination has intensified an already extreme polarization, exacerbated by stalled health and tax reforms that threaten a systemic collapse of essential public services. Against this backdrop, the security situation has deteriorated alarmingly. Analysts call 2025 the year of surprises, with the country experiencing its highest levels of armed conflict in over a decade. The human cost is staggering. By July, over 85 social leaders, the community organizers, environmental defenders, and human rights activists who form the backbone of civil society, were assassinated. Their murders are a deliberate strategy by armed groups to silence dissent and exert territorial control. Consequently, mass displacements have surged in strategic regions like Cauca and Catatumbo. The violence has also taken on a disturbing new dimension: targeted religious persecution. In July, a mass grave in Guaviare revealed 8 religious leaders' bodies, 7 of them evangelicals. This highlights a troubling paradox. As the evangelical community grows in influence, its leaders become more visible targets for armed groups who view their community work as a threat. This analysis synthesizes data from Human Rights Watch's 2025 World Report, the ICRC, Open Doors, and UN Security Council briefings. We also examine the international dimension, where diplomatic strains with the US have grown over Petro's anti-Israel stance and his shift in drug policy. Much of today's violence stems from the failure to implement the 2016 FARC peace accord, which left power vacuums filled by the ELN and Clan del Golfo. With 2026 elections on the horizon, bridging these divides is urgent to safeguard a fragile democracy. This critique offers actionable recommendations to foster reconciliation and stability. Colombia in turmoil, an expanded 2025 analysis of political deadlock, social fractures, and religious persecution. In 2025, Colombia's political landscape is a battleground. President Gustavo Petro'S ambitious Paz Total policy, aiming to end all armed conflicts, is locked in a struggle against the entrenched obstacles of political gridlock, powerful economic interests, and a deeply fractured society. The administration did secure a hard-won victory with its landmark labor reform. Passed in June, the law enhances overtime pay and job stability by limiting precarious short-term contracts. For unions like the QT, it was a historic gain, but business associations warned the move would stifle hiring, deepening the divide between labor and capital in an already fragile economy. Similarly, the pension reform passed in June 2024 fundamentally restructures the system. It redirects contributions from private funds to the public entity, Colpensiones, aiming to create a unified system to provide a basic pension for millions of impoverished elderly. Critics, however, fear it will drain state finances and undermine individual savings. In the countryside, agrarian reform showed flickers of progress. In the conflict-ridden Magdalena Medio region, 18,000 hectares were redistributed to 5,000 rural families. Yet, this is a drop in the ocean. The national goal of formalizing 3 million hectares remains a distant dream, with bureaucratic hurdles ensuring only 3% of promised land titles have been delivered. But where some reforms advanced, the critical health reform stalled in the Senate. The current system of private insurers, or EPS, is on the verge of collapse, burdened by $8.2 billion in debt. With hospitals facing bankruptcy, Petro issued a stark warning. If Congress fails to act, he will declare a state of emergency and intervene by decree, setting up a major constitutional confrontation. To fund these programs, a $6.5 billion tax reform was proposed, featuring windfall taxes on fossil fuels and higher progressive rates. The government framed it as a matter of social equity, but the business community fired back, arguing it would deter foreign investment and worsen the country's persistent 12% unemployment rate. As legislative battles raged, the political climate grew toxic. In September, Petro called for a popular rebellion to pressure his opponents, a move that energized his base but intensified national polarization. The political cost was clear. His approval rating sank to 35%, and his historic pact coalition scrapped its 2026 primary, signaling deep internal uncertainty. This domestic turmoil was mirrored by a crisis in foreign relations. The U.S. decertified Colombia as a partner in the war on drugs, citing an alarming 266% spike in potential cocaine production under Petro's new anti-drug strategy. This led to the unprecedented revocation of visas for the president and top officials. The economic fallout was swift, as the IMF, citing fiscal instability, suspended Colombia's access to its flexible credit line. At the heart of the conflict is Petro's green transition, which faces fierce resistance from the powerful extractive industries. While allies mobilized at the National Popular Summit for protests, the UN urged caution and a focus on peace. The final straw came when the Senate rejected a referendum on the reforms. Petro's response, a vow to override the legislature with presidential decrees, has pushed Colombia to the brink of a constitutional crisis, with its democratic future hanging in the balance. In the shadow of a fragile peace, armed conflict has not just returned, it has mutated. Power vacuums left by the demobilized FARC have been filled by a complex web of new and old armed actors, plunging vast territories back into a state of war. This resurgence has made Colombia, once again, the world's most dangerous country for those who dare to defend their land, their environment, and their communities. The statistics paint a grim picture of this targeted onslaught. By July alone, 85 social leaders had been assassinated, a chilling 20% increase in violence aimed directly at civilians. These weren't random acts. They were calculated strikes against the very heart of civil society: environmental activists protecting rivers from illegal mining, indigenous leaders safeguarding ancestral lands, and community organizers building alternatives to violence. Each death is an attempt to silence dissent and dismantle community resistance from the ground up. The cumulative effect of this violence has created a staggering humanitarian crisis. The International Committee of the Red Cross has declared 2025 the most severe humanitarian year in over a decade. This isn't just about the direct conflict, it's about the cascading consequences, mass confinement where entire villages are trapped by armed groups, a sharp rise in food insecurity as farmers are driven from their land, and the collapse of basic health and education services in contested zones. Amid this chaos, the most vulnerable are preyed upon. The conflict has historically stolen the childhood of over 18,000 minors. And today, forced recruitment is spiking alarmingly. In border regions like Arauca and Norte de Santander, armed groups exploit the lack of opportunity, luring children with false promises of money and power, or simply taking them by force. For these children, the front line is their new schoolyard, a devastating loss for them and a tragic blow to Colombia's future. Terror is a primary tool of control. By mid-year, the country had already witnessed 22 massacres, defined as the killing of 3 or more people in a single event, claiming 67 lives. These brutal acts are public displays of power, waged by warring factions like the ELN, the powerful narco-trafficking Clan del Golfo, and various FARC dissident groups who reject the peace process. They fight for control of drug routes, illegal mines, and local populations, using massacres to eliminate rivals and sow widespread fear. Underpinning the violence is one of Latin America's most unequal societies. With a Gini coefficient of 0.55, the gap between rich and poor is a chasm. This inequality is not abstract, it has a face. It disproportionately impacts Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, who have historically been denied land rights, political power, and access to basic services. This systemic marginalization makes them exceptionally vulnerable, their territories becoming the primary battlegrounds for resources and control. When armed groups arrive, the first casualty is home. In 2025 alone, over 100,000 people were forcibly displaced, fleeing with only what they could carry. Regions like Chaco on the Pacific coast and the mountainous Cauca department have become epicenters of this exodus. These are not just strategic corridors for armed groups, but are also rich in gold, coca, and biodiversity, turning communities into obstacles to be removed in a violent quest for profit. The discovery of a mass grave in Guaviare in July sent a shockwave through the nation, a grim testament to the systematic targeting of those who form the moral and organizational backbone of their communities. The victims included social organizers and even religious leaders, individuals whose influence posed a direct threat to the absolute control sought by armed factions. The public assassination of José Erlery Velasco, a beloved community leader from Cauca, brought this brutal strategy into sharp focus. His death prompted an outcry from national and international organizations, issuing urgent calls for the government to move beyond rhetoric and implement effective protection mechanisms for communities under siege. The promise of the 2016 peace accord feels increasingly hollow for those who laid down their arms. In the volatile Catatumbo region, 9 former FARC combatants were murdered, a stark reflection of the state's failure to guarantee their security. Without robust economic opportunities or protection from rival groups, the path of reintegration has become a death sentence for many. For women, the risks are compounded. Female activists are not only targeted for their leadership, but also face the horrific threat of sexual violence, used systematically as a weapon of war to terrorize families and shred the social fabric. Organizations like Ruta Pacífica de las Mujeres courageously work to document these atrocities, fighting against a culture of silence and impunity that allows most abuses to go unpunished. The conflict is not confined to rural areas. In cities like Bogotá and Medellín, aggressive urban gentrification displaces low-income residents. Into these destabilized barrios, paramilitary successor groups move, imposing a violent order through extortion. When residents protest, they are often met with excessive force by the police. Human Rights Watch has documented these abuses, alongside a frustrating lack of progress on meaningful police reform. This cycle of violence thrives in a climate of impunity. Freedom House rates Colombia as only partly free, highlighting a justice system that is largely absent. An estimated 70% of the rural population has no effective access to justice, creating a vacuum where armed groups become the de facto law. This state abandonment forces families into desperate situations. Child labor remains rampant, with 500,000 miners forced into grueling work in illegal mines and on coca plantations, their futures sacrificed for daily survival. Ultimately, all these threads weave a tapestry of systemic failure. Socioeconomic gaps are widening as basic services and state protections evaporate. This fragmentation is financed by the persistent economics of the cocaine trade, which entrenches a pervasive cycle of fear. While the state appears stretched thin, it is the local communities who bear the true cost. From the jungles of Cauca to the borderlands of Catatumbo, they stand resilient but exhausted, demanding not just aid, but urgent, localized responses that finally address the root causes of their suffering. Catholicism remains dominant at 84.76%, while evangelicals surge to 18%, with 5.94% independent Christians and 20% non-religious. Colombia ranks 46th on Open Doors' 2025 World Watch list for high pressure and violence against Christians. Criminal groups in Antioquia and indigenous territories target believers and leaders. In Guaviare, 7 evangelicals among 8 victims had fled prior threats from Arauca. In some indigenous zones, converts face harassment, displacement, or death for rejecting traditional practices. Armed groups exploit religious tensions to control territory. August's National Day of Religious Freedom united 17 faiths in dialogue. May's International Congress on Religious Tourism stressed evangelization and peace. A 2024 ruling mandates interreligious education, countering dogmatic curricula. Bills 057 and 058 of 2025 sparked disinformation, labeled as endorsing witchcraft. Over 30 faiths, including Adventists, voiced opposition and sought clarity. Petro'S tax reform on churches' commercial ventures fueled secularism debates. Priest kidnappings, like Father Jaime Guerrero's June ordeal, highlight vulnerability. Freedom House notes general respect for religious rights, but conflict zones remain risky. Interfaith initiatives show pathways to coexistence under pressure. Pluralism survives, but persecution shadows its promise. Policy clarity and protection can convert fragile tolerance into durable peace. Systemic flaws interlock: polarization, impunity, and elite-driven exclusion. Congress, beholden to Uribista elites and lobbies, dilutes reforms. Inequality persists and capital flees amid tax debates. Total peace devolved into localized truces as violence tripled in key regions. Convictions and activist killings sit below 10%, fueling endless violence. Visa rows and IMF fallout expose polarizing rhetoric and obstructive opposition. Political establish a bipartisan National Dialogue Commission by November 2025, mediated by UN and OAS. Blend public oversight with EPS in health. Index taxes to inflation for equity. Enhance 2026 election security with international observers, prioritizing Cauca. Social. Allocate 1 BIs to expand the National Protection Unit and deploy early warning systems. Accelerate land reform to 1 M hectares by 2027, with crop substitution in cocaine zones. Combat recruitment via youth programs and ICRC-partnered humanitarian access. Religious. Revise bills 057, 058 to protect freedoms and exclude coercive practices. Exempt core religious activities from taxes and focus audits on commercial abuses. Cross-cutting. Create a 3B impunity reduction fund to reach 50% conviction rates by 2028. Diversify with green investments targeting a 30% renewable GDP share by 2030. Leverage digital platforms for transparent citizen feedback and monitoring via UN benchmarks. Glimmers of hope persist. Labor wins, land distributions, interfaith unity. Critique exposes betrayals of peace promises. Recommendations chart a roadmap to equity and renewal.